The West Indies has one of the most interesting collections of ornithological literature of any biogeographic region in the world, from one of the earliest field guides to some modern takes on the genre, and of course the connection to an international spy. The region has ties to some iconic bird books that you should add to your shelf, and some you should probably pass on. If you're new to this channel, I'm Doug Hitchcock, and my goal is to get the most people to see the most birds. I led a birding trip to Jamaica earlier this year and naturally wanted the best field guide for the trip. And in this video, I'll talk about my top choices and go through all the books I uncovered in selecting them. Real quick, before we look at the books, I want to clarify the region we are covering. We're generally talking about the islands in the Caribbean Sea, plus the Lucayan Archipelago from the Bahamas through the Turks and Caicos Islands. Within that larger Caribbean, there are some islands like Trinidad and Tobago in the ABCs, which have bird life more similar to South America than the other islands and are not considered part of the West Indian avifauna. The term West Indies is a relic of colonial misnaming from when European explorers thought they were in the western islands of the Indies of Asia. Ornithologically, we stick with the West Indies for this subset. Now you know. Alright, I want to start with a book that I don't own, but it is the first ornithological treatment of the region, Charles Cory's The Birds of the West Indies from 1889. This book started as a series of papers published in the Auk describing new species and forms as the region was being explored by ornithologists. But this book was produced to aggregate and update those papers, as well as pull in a large number of new discoveries being made. As much as I'd love to pick this up for my bookshelf, it is long past its copyright date and hard to beat having free access to an archive online. Charles Cory was a fascinating character himself. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he used his father's fortune to focus on his early interest in birds and amassed a massive collection of bird skins. He was one of the founding members of the American Ornithologists Union, and perhaps best known in the modern era as people call out Cory Shearwater from pelagic trips. That species honorific coming from Charles Cory, who described the type specimen shot off Chatham, Massachusetts in 1881. Back to the book. It is outdated and more entertaining than useful for most birders, but since it is free to flip through online, I'd still recommend it as there are some gems to be found. Like some great ivory-billed woodpecker lore, including descriptions of the Cuban subspecies. Remember, Cory had a huge specimen collection, and he writes about the 18 ivory-billed skins that he had. Cory also writes about visiting Gunnlaug's collection, often called the grandfather of Caribbean ornithology, to see an ivory-billed with an overgrown upper mandible, which he described as an ornithological monstrosity. Let's jump ahead almost 50 years to the release of James Bond's Birds of the West Indies. This first edition, published by the Academy of Natural Sciences, where Bond worked, came out in 1936, almost 2 years after Roger Tory Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds came out. As a guide, it falls short of today's standards, with only about 70% of species illustrated, and only 25 with color illustrations. That said, Don Eckelberry's color plates are beautiful, and he obviously chose species that would be visually appealing, like parrots, hummingbirds, honeycreepers, and toadies. Earl Poole's black and white line drawings are better supported with the text descriptions because you really can't appreciate a golden swallow or northern parula in black and white. Along with their descriptions, most species have details on habitat they use, what they sound like, details on their nests, and an underused vocab word nidification section. And my favorite is the inclusion of the list of local names. Knowing these colloquial names, which could vary by island, is very useful for visiting birders, especially when working with a local guide. That said, it is noted in the preface that, quote, bear in mind that West Indian, when asked the name of a bird he does not know, is apt to conjure up one that he thinks is suitable. A shortcoming of this guide is the lack of attention to many of the migratory species that use the West Indies, especially the wintering birds. This is addressed with the inclusion of a note that, quote, the reader is advised to have on hand one of the standard field guides to North American birds to supplement this book. The Golden Guide by Chan Robbins is specifically mentioned. This approach has been seen in a few very popular guides over the years, like the famous Howell and Webb Birds of Mexico. Despite the lack of representation, that book and Bond's have clearly not been held back, being regarded as the standard for their regions. Bond was the go-to for 50 years, with 5 different editions published and various editions from the big names from Peterson Field Guides, Houghton Mifflin, and Collins for our Old World readers. Before jumping to the book that would take Bond's place at the top, we have to address the obvious elephant in the room, and that is Bond. James Bond. As you probably know, the British author Ian Fleming created a character, a fictional British secret agent who would be the main character in a dozen novels, beginning with Casino Royale in 1952. Many of those would be adapted into the now 27 movies that have grossed a combined $8 billion, and of course that agent, codenamed 007, was named James Bond. The story here is that Fleming himself was a birder and had a copy of James Bond's Birds of the West Indies while he was living in Jamaica writing his first novel, and decided to use the name because it was, quote, brief, unromantic, Anglo-Saxon, and yet very masculine. Fleming would also describe it as the simplest, dullest, plainest sounding name he could find, which is wonderfully ironic as a character who would go on to embody the exact opposite of that. I'll stop here in the lore of James Bond because I simply can't do it all justice in this video. I will strongly recommend either reading Jim Wright's book, The Real James Bond, a wonderfully written biography about the ornithologist, or watching The Other Fellow, a documentary from 2023, available for free with ads on YouTube, which takes a deep dive into people who share the James Bond name. The one thing I will highlight from the cinematic James Bond lore is the next book on my list, also called Field Guide to the Birds of the West Indies, but this one by Taryn Simon. This is probably not a familiar name for many birders, but Simon is a contemporary artist whose research-based works examine systems of knowledge and classification. Of their many works, we get this massive tome where, quote, Simon casts herself as James Bond the ornithologist and identifies, photographs, and classifies all the birds that appear within the 24 films of the James Bond franchise. And it is every bird in every movie. The birds are not identified, but organized by the country they were filmed in. It is fun as a birder to try and identify the birds, although it is mostly gulls and pigeons, but some surprises mixed in, like this apparent flock of choughs from the Swiss Alps. My favorite part of this book was past all these pulled frames, and in the back quarter where Simon includes pages showing birds collected by Bond with excerpts from his field guide. A fun peek at some of the specimens that you need pretty exclusive access to a museum to ever see. This is followed by a number of Bond's correspondence, publications, and artifacts. These are just fascinating to flip through, reading his letters to get his book published, his correspondence at the Academy of Natural Sciences as the curator of birds, and checklists acquired in studying the distribution of birds across the West Indies. This is actually considered part 2 of Simon's Birds of the West Indies series. The first takes the same name as Bond's field guide and copies the jacket design of the first edition. Simon's version is described as, quote, a photographic inventory of the women, weapons, and vehicles of James Bond films. This is another funky collection of art, but a fun addition to the James Bond Birds of the West Indies lore. Okay, I lied. One more thing. Birds of the West Indies does have a brief cameo in the 2002 Die Another Day, when Bond, played by Pierce Brosnan, claims to be an ornithologist as cover. Just before the scene of him using his binoculars to watch Halle Berry emerge from the ocean, we see Bond borrowing those binoculars and a 5th edition of the Birds of the West Indies published by Collins. This appearance has made this version a collector's item amongst Bond fans as well as birders, and it is annoyingly used as the stock image of the guide on sites like eBay and Abe Books, so it's really hard to find anyways. If anyone watching this has a 5th edition Collins copy you are willing to part with, please hit me up. So I mentioned that Bond reigned supreme for 50 years, and that was until 1998 when the identification guide, Birds of the West Indies, was written by Herbert Raphael, James Wiley, Orlando Garrido, Alan Keith, and Janice Raphael. This guide would essentially make up for all the shortcomings that Bond had, most notably having plates and full species counts of all the birds that use the West Indies. Plates are at the beginning, then maps and extensive accounts are in the back. Tracy Peterson and Kristen Williams were the principal illustrators, and you'll find some gorgeous full-page artwork from others throughout. like this Cuban trogon by Roman Company. I want to quickly point out this was published by Princeton University Press in the US, but I've always thought this kind of OG layout here by Helm was how a field guide should look. The clean, minimalist look is oddly satisfying, especially with the consistency across the other guides and monographs, but you can pick up a Princeton copy really cheap now. Even better, in 2003, this would be boiled down into a true field guide, going from nearly 8 by 10 inches to 5 by 8.5, and ditching most of the text for a more concise layout. And in 2020, it was updated in the current second edition. Now you have an easy to travel with guide with all the birds you can find and much more up-to-date taxonomy. While most of the artwork has stayed the same, there are some new species added, mostly rare or vagrant species in the region. One example being a mangrove vireo by Dale Dyer added, which looks like the same illustration for the birds of Central America, just flipped. Interestingly, one of my biggest complaints of the birds of Central America was how muted all the plates were. So it's fun to see the same art used here with the colors much more accurately depicted. This was one of the primary guides I used for studying for my Jamaica trip, but I do recommend picking up the larger identification guide too, because the complete accounts do hold some helpful hints. Even if it's just an additional sentence or two, I like learning everything I can about a species I'm looking for the first time. Taking another step to reducing the size and content in a guide, we get Norman Arlot's Birds of the West Indies, which is part of the Princeton Illustrated Checklist series. As an illustrated checklist, we get many species packed onto one page, with short descriptions and habitats listed. Range maps are separated and put in the back of the book. I am impressed with how many illustrations are still included, like all the subspecies of bananaquits being shown. But there is something about the artwork in many of these where it feels like it's a similar template that was used across a family with field marks for each added to that. Like how all these warblers have nearly identical body shapes, or these vireos just lack a bit of their uniqueness. If you want the most pocketable guide to the region, this is probably your best bet, but beware it doesn't have the extensive coverage of the Raphael book. So now we get to book 7 on my list, and this is the one I decided to bring with me. This is The Birds of the West Indies by Guy Kirwan, Anthony Levesque, Mark Oberl, and Christopher Sharp, published by Lynx Edition, now known as Lynx Nature Books. I'm a big fan of the artwork here, which pulls from 29 different artists, but they do generally blend well enough that you don't get the sharp contrast I've complained about with other guides mixing too many artists. There are a lot of names you'll be familiar with, like Brian Small, Douglas Pratt, and Ian Lewington, just to name a few. It is fun to see Norman Arlot here. Interestingly, the illustrations used are different from the ones in his illustrated checklist, like this king rail. You will recognize these plates from Lynx Handbooks of the Birds of the World, or if you use Birds of the World online. The other big reason I preferred to use this book on the trip is the taxonomy. The second edition Princeton guide was actually published more recently than this Lynx book, but Princeton has always followed the AOU checklist, while Lynx uses the HBW BirdLife checklist, which I find to generally be more closely aligned to the eBird Clements or Avalist, which is what we all use now. And ultimately, I wanted a field guide on me that was going to be most closely aligned with the eBird list I was keeping, so that is why the slightly larger Lynx book won out for me. I need to give a couple of honorable mentions. As you look around the West Indies, there are many more field guides to smaller regions that you may actually prefer if you are only visiting a single island. Like this little photo guide, which was more fun for my non-birding wife to flip through. And of course it is hard to beat having Merlin in your pocket at all times. It still comes up short as an actual field guide, but you can see Cornell working towards improving that with the added habitat information. I'm also hopeful we'll see a new field guide coming. One that I know Jesse Fagan, author of The Birds of Northern Central America, was working on. Andrew Gutenberg, who we saw provide great updates to the new National Geographic guide last year, was working on illustrations for this, which is apparently on hold. But that duo would make a killer guide, and it would be a great addition to the rich ornithological history of this region. If you made it this far, drop a comment of what region you'd like to see me do a video on the field guides of next. There is a third edition of Garrigus' Birds of Costa Rica coming out later this year, which feels worthy of covering. I do have a couple videos coming soon reviewing some AI-powered binoculars and other fun birding tech, so get subscribed so you don't miss those. As always, Thanks for watching.